Hi, and welcome back to another one of our videos. We're going to talk in this video about how to build the 100-point fantasy team and why this is so important. And we use this metrics a lot when we talk about fantasy, myself and Al. I'm on my own today. But for the purpose of this video, what I want you to do is just sort of sit back, think about it, make some notes, and also tell us your thoughts, your comments, etc. around what we're going to talk about. So the first thing I always do whenever I'm thinking about the team is to work out what value every position has. So if you want to consider players, what are the value of all these players? What is it going to do to your fantasy team? And the best place to start is with the quarterbacks. Not necessarily that you're going to take one first, it's just to consider their fantasy point value. And so the first thing I always try to do with it is, if you look at any of the quarterbacks that you can pick up, what we always say in most fantasy circles, you want your quarterback every single week to at least bring in 15 fantasy points. The best ones bring in between 80 and 20 fantasy points every single week. So that's what you're looking at. You need to consider when and if you're going to take a quarterback early or late and what it does for you. So when people are talking to you and saying, it might be worth your while taking one of the best three quarterbacks early in a league. And we're just talking in this video, we're just going to assume it's a standard league. It's a redraft, not dynasty or any of those things. There's no particular extra value points or anything. We're just talking about a standard situation. If you take one of the elite quarterbacks, what you're really saying is you're going to get 18 fantasy points from them for any given week over the course of the year. So that's why people do honestly target them. But we have to remember, though, that most quarterbacks can get you at least 15. So there's a reason why a lot of experts will sit and wait for quarterbacks when they're drafting. So that's the first thing to consider. And also what type of quarterbacks to target. So often, again, when I'm looking at things, I like to think about the situation they've got for the year ahead. Are they going to be throwing the ball a lot? If they are, that's bound to yield more fantasy points. Whether it's garbage time or not is unimportant. When it comes to winning, the most important thing is outscoring your opponent, not the actual real result in real life. And that can come down to having quarterbacks who are in good spots in terms of fantasy. And that's something always to consider. So I want you to weigh that first thing up in your mind's eye. Now let's just think for a moment. Let's assume that we've got a 15-point quarterback. There's a reason why people do draft two quarterbacks. And there are a number of podcasts out there that hinted at this and talked about it a little bit, which is when you have two quarterbacks, you can look at the matchups very closely and try to put the best quarterback situation in for your team each week. In large leagues, it's very difficult to get more than two quarterbacks, where in smaller leagues, like 10-team leagues, it's quite easy to have at least two quarterbacks you can lean on, or even just stream them, which is another option available to you. And you can look at the matchup. So, for example, if you're going up a good defense, what are the chances of your quarterback producing his best points of the year? It's slimmer. Whereas if he's up against a team that's leaking points all over the place and has done so for a number of years, of course the matchup looks great on paper. Things can always go wrong. You know this every year when you play fantasy. Best laid plans always fall apart. But over the course of a year, because you've considered all the small details, you will get more chances to shine. So I want you to think about, have a thought in your own mind's eye about quarterbacks early or late, the reasons around why you do it, and what you can gain out of it. Even if you look at the best quarterbacks from last year and you consider them against the middle of the road quarterbacks who might have been taken 10 or 12, there's not a lot of points in it. It can almost seem like there's only 2 or 3 points a week that's in it. And that actually really comes to one thing, really, that over the course of a season, those 3 points might be worth 1 or 2 wins. It is significant because in fantasy that can be the difference between making the playoffs or not. But if you make up those points elsewhere, you don't need an elite quarterback. Something to consider. The other thing to work out this year, particularly this year, is when we're building this 100-point team. When you're talking about running backs, there aren't that many studs. We're already seeing a lot of issues, and myself and Al have talked about this in our podcast, about what's going to happen with the number of players. Are they going to make it through the preseason, let alone start? And these are things you're going to have to weigh up as well. So I'm a real big advocate that I always say all the time, I don't go in with a set plan. I don't think about I'm going to achieve a 0 RB strategy. I don't think about I want 3 running backs rounds 1, 2 and 3 or any of those things. I don't think about that at all. I look for the best player available and I base it on my own metrics, and I would advise all of you to start building your own. There are certain advantages you have. For example, when you go to a player that's played in the NFL for a few years, you have history. When you have history, it's easy to work out if that player is somebody you can count on to produce a certain level of points. A good example where it went wrong last year, but it was logical, is somebody like Des Bryant. Every year before last year, Des Bryant, you could clock him on for 1,300 to 1,400 yards, 12 to 14 touchdowns for nearly every year for about 7 years until last year. So even the best laid plans can fall apart. But that history is very useful because he was doing it. That's what he's capable of doing. So you're going to believe he's going to bounce back from this year's injury. And you may be able to nab Des late in some of the smaller leagues. And that's a fantastic pickup player because you know what he's capable of doing. Players that are at the top of their tier, if you will, the top of their tree, you're going to be able to count those players in for 15 fantasy points, 12.5 to 15 fantasy points each. So let's look at it logically so far. If we talk about running backs, and we've got 2 running backs we can count on, we should expect from them somewhere in the range of about 25 fantasy points for the 2 running backs each week, plus the 15 we've got for our quarterback. So we've now got 40 fantasy points. If we can do the same with our wide receivers, so again another 25 points, we're already sitting at 65. These are the kind of things you have to start working out, what that player's going to bring in week by week. If you've got a boom or bust player, someone like maybe a John Brown is a good example for Arizona, he may get on average 6 to 8 fantasy points every week, and then one week he'll get you 16 to 20. Those are great players to have in a week where you're going up against a team that's really consistently churning out really good fantasy numbers, and you think to yourself, there's no other way I can match these guys because for 5 weeks they've consistently got this level of production and I'm never sure what my team's going to bring in. I always take chances on players who might be able to do it. And that's what I would advise you to try and do. Just take some shots at these boom or bust players. And John Brown's one of those. So let's look at what we've got. We've got our quarterback bringing us 15 points in. We've got 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers bringing us in 25 points from each area. We're now at 65. You can look at tight end. It's a very, very tricky area, tight ends. The best in the business is Gronkowski, and underneath that there's a huge difference between everybody else. Even if you look at the tier beneath him, those guys, if they can bring in 135 to 150, and there's only a few players you can count on to maybe do that, that's the best you can hope for. Gronkowski will get you about 180, and that's his top level, I think, at the moment with New England's situation. So what I try to do is I take a middle-of-the-road tight end that I believe is going to explode for this year to get the points I need. I only ever look for, from the tight end, every week, 7 to 8 fantasy points. That's all I'm ever looking for. So we err on the side of caution and say 7. Our team is now up to 72. Okay, 72 fantasy points. It doesn't sound great because all we've got left to really consider here is the defense and the kicker. But we've got to work out that I'm looking at the worst case scenario. I'm still judging this team. That's what I'm expecting. I'm not expecting it, some running back to have a great day and get me 25 points. I'm just saying this would be the consistent level I want. Now, if I add my 7 points on, I'm up to 72. So if we take now my defense, I want my defense also to get me around about 8 fantasy points every week. So my team now is up to 80. I then add in my kicker, and again, I'm not expecting a huge amount. I'm looking at about 8 points. So my team is up to 88 fantasy points. I'm still 12 short, but that's what I'm expecting somewhere in the rest of my team that I've built, that they're going to give me those additional 12 points. If I can achieve 90 fantasy points in large leagues that I've hinted at before, I know that's a metrics I use very often when I talk about building teams, because if you're in a 16-man league and you can achieve 90 points, I have proved this consistently, and even the Sharks now agree this is a metrics they use. I'm sure they use it in regular conversations. 90 fantasy points gives you an 80% chance of winning in a 16-man league. If you drop to 80 fantasy points, and you can do the maths yourself, the odds of winning drop to 60%. So it's very easy to work out, whatever your team scores, what your odds are that week of actually doing it. Of course, you're going to meet weeks where you're unlucky. The rub of the green isn't there. You get 100 fantasy points and someone out-muscles you. That's the way it goes in fantasy. But if you can maintain that consistency, you will come through as a playoff team. The 100-point team is what I call the dream team. It's the dream team you're looking for in these large leagues. It's a number I love to use in 14-man leagues. If I was using a 12-man league or a 10-man league, I'm looking to build 110 points. But for this video, to catch your eye, 100 points always sounds good. But that's what I would do. That's the mythology. That's the way you look at it when you're building these teams. So let's quickly recap this. First of all, you consider every position. You work out what those players should be getting you on a week-by-week basis. You look at the worst situations, which is why it's always more difficult when you're in a large league to get the consistent points. You're hoping your stud will make up for the weaknesses maybe of your not so good second player or not so good flex position. We haven't really talked about the flex position so far in building the points. There's one area we haven't covered off, but that's where the additional uprise of those 12 points can come from. It's from the flex. I hadn't mentioned it, but I better add that in. So you can quite clearly see how it is possible, but it's so difficult to achieve. But when you get that mindset in your head and you start considering these things, I think what you'll find is this will help you elevate your team better than other people around you, give you a best chance of getting to the playoffs, because that's really where it's all about, thinking ahead to the playoffs. And I know me and Al in other videos are going to talk about some of the things you can do as we enter into the seasons to start adjusting your team to get it playoff ready. But for now, when you're drafting, just weigh up everything and put yourself in a position to draft the best team you have available. And this is one method to use to do that. Anyway, thanks for listening this week, and I look forward to catching you again on one of these videos. Bye for now.